So thanks for being here, everybody, on this kind of rainy afternoon for our webinar on John Lewis, the beloved community and energy justice. My name's Erin Perry, and I am currently working with Tennessee Interfaith Power and Light as a student at Vanderbilt Divinity School. This morning, our presentation has been created by Dr. Dan Joranko, the coordinator of the UMC Tennessee Conference Creation Care Ministry, as well as the coordinator of Tennessee Interfaith Power and Light. We will not have a Q&A session at the end of this webinar today, but if you have any additional questions for Dan, I'll place appropriate contact info in the chat box for you to utilize if you would like to. For those who are here as participants of the Bountiful Bowl, thank you so much for being with us today. Please stay on the call after the presentation is over, and then we'll eat communally together. Everyone else who is with us today, thank you as well. All are welcome to join us for dinner after the presentation, but the presentation itself should only last an hour or so. So don't feel like you have to stay on with us. So please, throughout the presentation today, make sure that you are muted. You can find the mute button down in the bottom left corner of your screen, just so we can hear Dan as well as possible. And then, yes, our session will be recorded this afternoon for folks who will not be able to join us. So we will send out that recording once it is edited and uploaded. So before I turn it over to Dan, I just want to say a little bit more to introduce him. As I said before, Dan is the current coordinator of both Tennessee Interfaith Power and Light and the United Methodist Tennessee Conference Creation Care Ministry. He has a PhD in resource development from Michigan State University and a Master's of Divinity from Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. Dan has worked for many years on social justice concerns, primarily through Tennessee Alliance for Progress, but also with the Tennessee chapter of Sierra Club, the Nashville Peace and Justice Center, and the Tennessee Environmental Council. Thank you, Dan, for creating this presentation for us today. So just one final reminder, just to stay muted throughout the presentation, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to Dan.
Yes, welcome. It's a great crowd today. If you're new to Zoom, you may want to go to speaker view, which is on the top right-hand corner. That way you can see me easier. So I'm going to do several things today. First of all, I'm going to reflect a bit on the life and philosophy of John Lewis, both at the beginning and towards the end of my presentation, through three themes at the center of really today's, political and cultural life today: racial justice, healthcare, and the whole climate and energy justice piece. And I'm going to share two stories of ordinary people in intensive, disciplined, direct action campaigns that I was heavily involved with. I think it's important to tell the stories, to remember their sacrifice, but also to inform and inspire for today. As most of you know, John Lewis has a strong Nashville connection. His personal formation came from both his strong sense of duty, formed in the Black church and the community in rural Troy, Alabama. But then, of course, he came up here to ABC, American Baptist Seminary in 1960, and very quickly became part of what has often been called the model civil rights campaign here in Nashville. Many people around the nation don't know it was really the Nashville campaign that probably kick-started the civil rights movement, which was kind of in a lull after the Montgomery boycott. There were things, of course, going around in the country, and the Greensboro sit-ins actually started before Nashville, but really Nashville became a very disciplined, strong campaign, and it was the first, Nashville was the first major southern city to desegregate its businesses due to this campaign. And then the leadership of this movement here in Nashville became really the young leadership of much of the national movement, with other folks, of course, across the country, but key leadership in the whole civil rights movement. It started with a training done by James Lawson. And some of you may know James Lawson. He's been back to Nashville. He was a student at the Vanderbilt Divinity School, and he had studied Gandhian tactics in India and really took a disciplined approach to Gandhian nonviolence or satyagraha, which is often translated truth or soul force. And I'm going to do an extended quote from John Lewis's autobiography. If you haven't read this book, it's one of the best books on the civil rights movement, Walking with the Wind, John Lewis's autobiography. And the extended quote about these trainings, John Lewis says, "Heaven and earth, this was the social gospel in action. This was love in action, or what we came to call in our workshop soul force. Jim Lawson knew, though he had no idea when we began, that we were being trained for a war unlike any this nation had seen up to that time, a nonviolent struggle that would force this country to face its conscience. Lawson was arming us, preparing us, planting in us a sense of both rightness and righteousness, soul force that would see us through the ugliness and pain that lie ahead, all in pursuit of something both he and Dr. King called the beloved community. This idea, beyond any other, was the fulcrum of all that Jim Lawson was teaching us. It was at the center as well of everything that Dr. King was working toward. As both men understood it, and as we were taught to believe in our workshops, the beloved community was nothing less than the Christian concept of the kingdom of God on earth. According to this concept, all human existence throughout history, from ancient Eastern and Western societies up through the present day, has striven toward community, toward coming together. That movement is inexorable, as irresistible as the flow of a river towards the sea. Whenever it is interrupted or delayed by forces that would resist it, by evil or hatred, by greed, by the lust for power, by the need for revenge, believers in the beloved community insist it is the moral responsibility of men and women with soul force, people of goodwill, to respond and to struggle nonviolently against the forces that stand between a society and the harmony it naturally seeks. These were incredibly powerful ideas, and their beauty was that they applied to real life and to the specifics of the world we walked in. They applied to Bird's drugstore and to the Troy Theater. They applied to the buses I rode to high school and to the all-Black classes in which I sat. They applied to the men and women who refused to serve Black people at the lunch counters of downtown Nashville. They applied to the admissions office at Troy State University. There were fewer than 10 of us at those first meetings, but soon the number began to grow. And out of these trainings came the sit-ins in downtown Nashville. And of course, the sit-in folks were attacked violently. They were jailed, and it was a very disciplined and extended campaign. They had strong support in the Black churches in Nashville, and they also had the support of the community, which boycotted the downtown businesses. The Black community and others in support of the movement boycotted the downtown businesses in support of the sit-ins. And then came the catalytic moment. There was a bombing. Alexander Luby was a prominent civil rights lawyer in Nashville. And his home, which the building still sits several blocks from where I live here in North Nashville, was bombed in retaliation against the sit-ins. And this was intended to terrorize people because segregation was really built upon terror. People would not allow themselves to be segregated had there not been terror behind it. But rather than cowing people, rather than hiding in fear, and people were concerned during, given the short notice, because they called a march to City Hall the next day that no one would show up. But over 5,000 people marched to City Hall, and they confronted the mayor. And I'll read once more from John Lewis's book. We walked 3 and 4 abreast in complete silence, blacks and white, 10 miles through the heart of Nashville. People came out of their homes to join us. Cars drove beside us, moving slowly at the speed of our footsteps. The line looked as if it went on forever. Everyone was very intense, but very disciplined and very orderly. It was a stupendous scene. There was some singing at first, but as we neared City Hall, it stopped. The last mile or so, the only sound was the sound of our footsteps. Dan Nash and C.T. Vivian were at the very front. I was a row or two back from them. When we reached City Hall, Mayor West in his bow tie and hat came down the steps out front to meet us. Vivian spoke first, saying how outraged we were that such a thing could happen in the city. The crowd exploded with applause at that. When West began to respond, Vivian cut him off, and the two argued for a minute or two. Then West made a plea with us to be peaceful. You all have the power to destroy this city, he said, so let's not have any mobs. Sound familiar today? We went on to say that he would enforce the laws without prejudice, but that he had no power to force restaurant owners to serve anyone they did not want to. Then he said, we are all Christians together. Let us pray together. To which one of our students shouted, how about eating together? Then Diane stepped forward. She held a typed list of questions which we'd come up with that morning. When she asked West if he would use the prestige of your office to appeal to citizens to stop racial discrimination, his answer was succinct. I appeal to all citizens, said the mayor, to end discrimination, to have no bigotry, to no bias, no hatred. Then Diane asked the million-dollar question, pushing the mayor to be specific. Do you mean that to include lunch counters? Now West was rankled. Little lady, he said, I stopped segregation several years ago at the airport when I first took office, and there has been no trouble there ever since. Diane didn't budge. Then Mayor, she said, boring in, do you recommend that the lunch counters be desegregated? Yes, said West. The crowd exploded, cheering and applauding. That's up to the store manager, of course, West added a little awkwardly, but those words were drowned out. All anyone had heard was the word yes. That's the word that rang out in the next morning's Tennessean, which ran a front page banner headline, Integrate Counters Mayor. So this led almost immediately to the desegregation of the downtown businesses. And the campaign continued on in Nashville around other points of desegregation, but the major victory was won. Lewis went on to be part of the Freedom Rides. He was a major speaker, of course, at the March on Washington. He participated in the Birmingham campaign, the Freedom Summer, and the Terror in Mississippi for voter registration and voting rights. And finally, the culminating moment of the civil rights movement, the March through Selma. John Lewis, that young man, very instrumental, very inspirational, very dedicated, and a strong commitment to nonviolence. He had that existential commitment to nonviolence. There was a strong faith link for Lewis, but the movement, of course, encouraged all who made either a strategic or principled commitment to nonviolence into the movement, and they shared their common humanity within this. So I'm going to move along to talk about a couple of other campaigns. Nonviolence has various dimensions. One is non-cooperation. We see this in the Montgomery boycott. Civil disobedience, the willingness to get arrested around unjust laws. Pacifism, not striking back against violence or looking for nonviolent alternatives to violence. And finally, a commitment to reconciliation between people. And these various dimensions can combine, and they can combine in various ways in direct action, which forces a confrontation. And direct action can include one or more of these other dimensions. To be nonviolent, of course, it needs to include that pacifism. It doesn't always include civil disobedience. The direct action campaign I'm going to talk about in Chicago really didn't, but we were very much involved in direct action and had these other dimensions in it. First, I'm going to talk, and this the nonviolent campaign in Nashville was really informed, I think, Nashville activism over the years. That strain has continued in our Nashville activism. And I'll talk about what became at least at that time, when we did it, it was the nation's longest sit-in at the governor's office. This was around TennCare, which was the medical insurance plan that covered around 1 million people in Tennessee. And it was admittedly a difficult budget situation, and it was difficult for states to solve the healthcare coverage on their own. But there was going to be scheduled cutbacks of 323,000 people from TennCare, and cutbacks on prescription drug coverage for about 700,000 people. And the Tennessee Healthcare Campaign, Tony Garr, also Gordon Bonnyman and others were challenging these cutbacks. And this was not entirely just simply a policy disagreement, but really, at least for us in the campaign, it was a deep fundamental concern for the suffering of the sick and the disabled and those without adequate means to have adequate health care. The Tennesseans said in an editorial right after we began the sit-in, the vigil kept this week by TennCare protesters might be futile and it might be desperate, but it is certainly understandable. The protesters, many of whom are themselves on TennCare, help remind the governor and all of Tennessee of the stakes as the administration moves forward with its plans. To these individuals and their families, TennCare reform isn't a calculated policy decision. It's a life-altering, perhaps life-ending problem. So those are the stakes that we felt, that deserved a strong, direct action, nonviolent campaign. It wasn't just a policy concern, but for many that were involved, they felt it was a life and death, perhaps a life and death situation. I actually got started on Martin Luther King Day. The campaign had been going before that, but my first involvement was on Martin Luther King Day. The governor was speaking, interestingly, at the Siegenthaler Center, and John Siegenthaler was, in fact, a journalist for the Tennessean who covered the civil rights movement. And he was speaking before some pastors there. So we had a bit of a protest outside of there. And I just had kind of come along to that protest. But then I really started feeling this deep in my insides and decided to become a bit of an organizer on this and use some of my organizing abilities on this campaign. One of the first protests was at the governor's second inauguration. There was a major protest outside of that, and that helped bring a commitment that children with serious medical conditions were kept on TennCare. So that was an early victory. The TennCare campaign started collecting stories of people were getting cut off. We'd go to places like food pantries and other places to collect these stories. And we would record these stories and write them up. And we often share these with legislatures. The legislative session was scheduled that year in 2005. We opened the legislative session with a march with about 500 people to the Capitol. And at that point, I started organizing through the Nashville Peace and Justice Center, the grassroots organizing committee with the healthcare campaign. This included folks from the Ad Hoc for Equity group, a group that had been trained in nonviolence, Henry Blaze and others out of the Missionary Baptist Church, a lot of people that were on TennCare. It was quite diverse, ethnically, racially, economically, a very diverse group. And there were about 30, 40 of us that would meet on a regular basis. We first started with some actions at the state legislature to try to get the legislature to roll back these cutbacks. 50 to 100 people were at Legislative Plaza nearly every day for several weeks. Grok organized that presence at the state legislature. We did some pray-ins inside Legislative Plaza. And through the Story Project, through these actions, we gathered some support from key legislatures. And I think we would have actually rolled back most of these cuts. But then there was something called Operation Tennessee Waltz, which was a sting operation, which caught some key legislatures and some, financial kickbacks. And this included some of the folks that were opposing the TennCare cutbacks. And that really derailed everything that we were doing. That sting operation had started, through the FBI about a year before, but it got announced right at the end of the legislative session and derailed our operation. And so we were kind of back to ground zero. On June 20th, which actually happens to be my birthday, folks, Matt Lieber, Reverend Henry Blaze, Carl Meyer, my housemate, who's done a lot of nonviolent direct action over the years, organized folks, about 20 folks, to go to the governor's office. And the idea was that they were going to have a sit-in there, and they were trained in civil disobedience. And some of the folks that agreed to get arrested would get arrested, others would peel off. It was at the governor's office. The governor decided not to arrest people. It would have been, arresting people with serious healthcare conditions. And to his credit, he didn't arrest people. And so it was kind of a challenge what to do. So they decided to stay. And this became a standoff. There were kind of informal rules. People can go in and out during the day. But once they were in there at night, they were there to stay, unless, of course, there was some kind of medical emergency or something. And this lasted for 77 days. Like I said, it was the nation's longest sit-in at the time. Some of the folks that were involved: Don Duvall, Lisa Abel, Randy Alexander, Kathy Chamberlain, Howard Allen, Glenn Barnhill, David Cobb, Jerry Spriggs, Stan Davidson, Lewis Patrick were some of the people on TennCare that were there quite often. Glenn was on a ventilator, and Glenn was probably there as much as anybody. And so these were people with serious conditions putting themselves on the line at the sit-in. We had strong congregation and community support. We had candlelight vigils and prayer vigils and singing vigils every day of those 77 days. People that helped support from the community include Nell Levin, Michael August, Jane Hussein, James Staub, Reverend Sonny Dixon, and others. I was there every 77 days outside, and really kind of, some of us were providing real support for the people inside, organizing community support of that and showing our support. Aaron, we're just going to show some pictures. You can just kind of cycle through them, Aaron. That's Glenn Barnhill. Reverend Blaze. That's Carl and Pam. Carl's one of my housemates.
And that's the last picture.
Yeah, those were taken by Al Levinson. On July 29th, about midway through this, we did a bell ringing project. It lasted 3 days. We had the Edge Hill United Methodist bell, and we rang the bell once for every 10 people affected by the cutbacks at 700,000 people in the prescription drugs. And we brought in people from many of Tennessee's 95 counties to ring the bell. They'd come in and ring the bell. And we were camped out at Legislative Plaza outside for 3 days in support of the sit-in. And the bell ringing was a very powerful symbolic action in support of the 10 Care campaign. We finally pulled out in early September. It was a long time to be inside. We were trying to, get the governor to negotiate talks around this, and also a special legislative session in support of this. And the governor never budged on those. But we did get some partial victories. They kind of cobbled together a safety net. On August 28th, there was an announcement that 97,000 of these people would be kept on. These were people with chronic conditions. They would be retained. So that was a victory. That was 100,000 people. There was also, this was very important to Glenn, some of the nursing care facility coverage would continue. On September 14th, there was a temporary halt for disenrollment of the remaining people so they could put together this kind of cobbled together safety net, which included Access Tennessee, Cover Kids, Cover Tennessee, which is coverage for small businesses, Cover RX for prescription drugs, a special call-in center to keep people with severe conditions in medical care. And so it kind of cobbled together a lot of support for the people that had been cut back on 10 Care. And so we did not get a full victory. But we got a lot of, I think, impact. And a couple other implications were that this really, I think, helped build the Tennessee Healthcare campaign, and included a couple key Democratic votes for the Affordable Care Act when it passed. And Tennessee was actually fairly critical for the passage of that bill, given how close that was the first time around. So the campaign built new leadership and strength, and was able to kind of follow through on that way nationally. It brought in new energy and leadership for the social justice advocacy in Nashville. A lot of social justice advocacy. I see Jane down there in the corner. Had been a little quiet at that time in the early 2000s, and a lot of the older leadership was cycling out, and newer leadership, particularly in the Black community, kind of came to the fore in this campaign. And people like Sekou Franklin, who studies this, really looks at this sit-in as the catalyst for much of that. And finally, I think just the impact on participants. I'm going to close this section with a quote from Glenn Barnhill. And this was in the national publication, The Nation, which did a major story on this. Glenn says, "The protest was the best thing I've ever put into, the best thing I put effort into in my life," says 10 Care enrollee Glenn Barnhill, a 45-year-old from Nashville who stocked grocery shelves at Kroger before he was rendered a quadriplegic from a gunshot wound to his brain. "If we don't keep fighting," Barnhill says between puffs on his ventilator, "these people are going to die." And so again, just the participation in this was very inspiring. The sacrifice of those people inside with those medical conditions, and all the people that came together, and the GROC, the Grassroots Organizing Committee, was just extraordinarily inspiring. And so it's just an example of I think, a very powerful nonviolent direct action around a very fundamental concern. Um, this presentation, as you may know, is part of the 24 Hours of Reality project through Al Gore's Climate Reality Project. And so, as I promised, I'm going to touch on energy justice, and how, that we're really, most of us on this call are very much involved in this whole climate action right now and the whole climate concern. And part of that is energy justice, making sure that folks with low income, are not impacted both by climate change across the world, but also that how we transition into this impacts people fairly, and in a way that people can afford energy, and things like low-income weatherization, and things of that nature that many of us are also committed to. And this was my first campaign as a community organizer. Again, a direct action campaign. I was with a group called the Northwest Community Organization. It was one of the 3 organizations that Saul Alinsky founded directly in Chicago. In fact, I used to sit at his old desk. And I think it's one of the finest community organizations that ever existed. It was on the near west side of Chicago. At one time, it was the heart of the Polish community. It trying to transition to become the heart of the Puerto Rican community, but also had substantial numbers of African Americans, European Americans, Mexican Americans. It was a mixed income community, but also had a couple of the poorest non-public housing neighborhoods in the city. The organization was founded in 1963, and it really did a good job of promoting Chicago at that time, and still largely is the nation's most segregated city in the United States. And NCO was very instrumental in building an integrated community. That's the beloved community. In fact, there was one census tract in Wicker Park at the heart of our community that was 1/3 African American, 1/3 Latino, and 1/3 European American. In the most segregated city in the United States, that's really something. It worked a lot on neighborhood stabilization. It fought bank redlining. It was instrumental in founding the National People's Action organization, and with a community out in South Austin, was really brought about the Community Reinvestment Act, which brought in billions of dollars and stopped redlining across the country, at least some of the redlining. Was also responsible for campaigns to stop arson for profit. There were many other victories over the years, and I'm not going to go into all of that. But eventually, the organization really got more and more involved in energy because utility bills and heat shutoffs were threatening people's lives in the community and across Chicago. In fact, over 100,000 households in Illinois in a major recession were being shut off every year. And you can imagine what it would be like in Chicago to be without heat. It's one of the coldest cities in the United States at times, or to be without electricity in the summer when you depend on, most of us didn't have air conditioning, but you depended on fans and things like that. So, yeah, so it was really, and there was a huge crisis. But this organization and the organization that we worked with in South Austin, we were we had been through this was before my time, but the Community Reinvestment Act really knew how to do these kind of campaigns, and ordinary people coming together. And so they came up with a plan that low-income people would pay 12% of their monthly income for gas and lights total. It was a percentage of income plan. This was really radical, that you would pay a percentage of your income. If you paid that, that would be enough. And community leaders kind of came together around this. We had support from the Mandel Legal Aid Clinic. Steph Krieger, an Orthodox Jew, was a very strong supporter of all this and did our legal work. But the plan was developed by the community people. This doesn't look like a really winnable issue, but we believed in it. We had a strategy committee that met every week. Coalition included the group out on the west side, a group on the south side. We eventually added Acorn, north side group. And like the civil rights movement, we had kind of this core, we had a core collective leadership around the campaign. And again, the Mandel Legal Clinic staffed it. We introduced a case in the Illinois Commerce Commission, which was the group that kind of regulated the utilities. Phil O'Connor was the chairperson. He was the campaign director for the then Republican governor, James Thompson. It was 4 Republicans and 3 Democrats on this. We started out with a press conference in June. We had the first hearing in August. We organized these bus loads to come in. That was really something, mobilizing people to get a bus load of people or 2 down from our neighborhood down to 10 o'clock hearing. You know, we'd ride the bus around the community. We'd do these car pickups. We'd have pickup spots at Catholic parishes all around the community. And a lot of the low-income people that were affected showed up for these hearings. We packed the hearing. Then the Illinois Commerce Commission agreed to 3 public hearings in October. This was really important. This would allow us to build our base, you know, get people involved, but they would also hear testimony. So we did this, you know, big mobilization to get people to these public hearings. And we had several hundred in our community, again, out in the west side and one out in the south side, and really gripping testimony about the impact of these heat shutoffs on people's lives. In late October, we found that the governor, a Republican governor, James Thompson, was going to be at a energy groundbreaking at Northwestern University. And we said, well, energy, this was a new energy center. Energy, that's kind of in our, that's in our field. So we organized 5 bus loads out to the northern suburb of Evanston. And they were all sitting, there were all these dignitaries sitting in this little tent. And we surrounded the tent with these 5 busloads of people, and they negotiated with us, and they said, well, we'll meet, the governor will meet with you after the, you know, they kind of had this balloon, and they cut this balloon, this giant balloon, after the groundbreaking. So he brought us all into the tent. Lucy Soto, the president of our organization, spoke for us, explained this bill. He had never, or this plan, he had never heard about it, but he agreed to meet with us in a week. And then he endorsed the concept. He actually endorsed the concept. This was really important because it gave it some legitimacy. We continued our campaign. We built a big endorser list of everything from the Archdiocese of Chicago to the March of Dimes actually signed on, the League of Women Voters, most of the religious denominations. Did a letter writing campaign. In late November, to symbolize the issue, one of the city council members talked at our hearing, alderman, about a woman who couldn't cook her turkey at Thanksgiving because her heat was off. And so we thought this was an interesting, gripping story. So we decided to bring a frozen turkey to the next Illinois Commerce Committee hearing and present it to Phil O'Connor. And so we did those kind of direct action types of things. And around Christmas, we presented the ICC with Christmas stockings with a block of ice in a stocking and sang Christmas carols with the words changed to be about heat shutoffs, frozen hands, frozen feet to silent night. So we used humor. You know, there was a lot of, you know, it diffused the anger in our group, but we also used humor just to kind of demonstrate these types of, you know, to kind of demonstrate things, dramatize things. And then by the end of December, we were really getting worried because, of course, people's heat wasn't, it was shut off. And this was people's real lives being affected. So we did something a little bit more radical. We showed up at the ICC Christmas party before the party, an hour before the party. We didn't want to interrupt their partying, but put shut off notices on their Christmas tree. And this ended up with a reconnection day with hundreds of people who got amnesty and got their heat turned back on. And so that was an important moment in the campaign. In January, a woman on the West Side died, froze to death. So we debated whether it would be appropriate, but we decided to do a mock funeral at the Illinois Commerce Commission. And really challenged. Phil O'Connor came down and our president really challenged him. And he agreed to drive around our community to visit people who had been shut off. And I and Lucy Soto drove around with him. We met with people in the community and he was visibly moved. I think this was the turning point. It really touched him morally, I think. And just meeting with and seeing these people and their families. And I remember a little infant in this room that was shut off. And the campaign continued. We got endorsements at the Chicago City Council. We developed support around the state, the Southern Counties Action Movement, groups in East St. Louis, Peoria. And in March, the ICC, they rotated their hearings from Springfield and Chicago. Springfield's 4 hours away. And to get down there at 10 in the morning meant people had to get up around 3:30 in the morning, load buses around 5 o'clock. But we had a full bus load to come down to this key hearing. They were pretty shocked to see us. But the Illinois Commerce Commission voted to support a modified 12% plan. You know, again, this was a Republican-controlled group, but they supported it. But it was only a partial victory because people would still owe the money. They would only delay it. They would still owe this other money. It would never get charged unless their incomes went up. We debated whether this was a victory or not. We decided it gave some legitimacy to the concept, but we need to keep pushing. Then a legislator, John DiArco, introduced this plan into the Illinois legislature. And now we were on different ground. We really hadn't had a lot of experience dealing with the legislature. Springfield's a long ways away. We're more used to dealing with, you know, local issues and things like that. But we learned. We learned how to lobby, talk to legislatures. DiArco was the Democratic whip, very powerful at the time. It passed through his committee easily, and it passed the Senate 31-28, straight party lines. We started getting editorial support. We met with editorial boards. State Representative Juan Solis was a sponsor in the House, but most importantly, the co-sponsor was Jim McPike, which was Michael Madigan's right-hand man. Michael Madigan was the powerful speaker of the Democratic, powerful speaker of the House. And so it easily passed the House with some bipartisan support. But now the governor needed to sign it, okay? And he had to sign it by early July. And he started to string us out, even though he had supported it originally. Jim Thompson started to string us out because nobody really thought this thing was going to pass. We actually started doing some actions. He was running for re-election. We got a hold of his campaign calendar. We even did an action out at the airport. This is pre-9/11 days, so air security was less, but he was going to Paris. And we caught him with TV cameras going to Paris, you know, kind of going to Paris for a junket while, you know, people are suffering in his home state. And late June, he finally agreed. You know, we were kind of pesky on his campaign trail. He agreed to meet with us. We had several hundred people at a rally at the State of Illinois Center. We filled up the place. Lucy Soto, our chairperson, chaired the meeting, and he announced that he would make a decision in 1 week. Okay. And we decided to mobilize, and we mobilized 800 people for this noontime action at the State of Illinois Center. And he met with us that day, said he was going to support it, brought all 800 people into this big auditorium, and it was electric. I mean, I've never seen anything like that. People were cheering the governor and shouting, "The people united will never be defeated." And it was just a powerful moment. And he found money for it, $120 million. There were these oil overcharge funds, these oil companies that overcharged people, and this money was there, and he was going to fund the plan. And so this was both one of the best days of our lives, but also a problem, because now he had amended the plan and it had to go back to the legislature. And the legislature passed it thinking that the governor was never going to sign it. Okay. And the powerful Illinois Chamber of Commerce, which included the utility companies as their major members, and the Illinois Manufacturers Association, both identified it as the bill they most wanted to defeat that fall. So we had to mobilize. So we mobilized across the state, talking to all the legislatures, visited them. In October, the Senate hearing, Joranko got it passed through his committee. And then it was going to go to the state Senate. We knew it was going to pass the House because we had McBike's support, and the House had more Democrats than. So the Senate was really the thing. And the problem was with this powerful Illinois, they started targeting some key Democrats who were up for re-election and telling them they would not be re-elected if they supported this. So we lost a couple Democrats. And a number of us went down on the lobbying team the day before. It was going to be voted in the state Senate. And again, 3 Democrats were going to vote present. But we started lining up some Republicans. We had become a bit of a moral cause. We were touching people's hearts. And so there were folks that were going to step out and support this thing. And we had about 10 lined up. And we actually, Jesse Jackson was down there, and he was going to be speaking to the legislature, and we got him to talk about this. And right after he spoke, I remember a Senator, Myron Custra, who was a West Side Republican, came out and he said, "Well, I support your bill, but the minority leader, Page Phillips, is going to caucus the Republicans. And if he caucuses the Republicans, they're all going to be forced to vote no." And so, you know, this was the day before all this work. We met with the Zach Stamp, the governor's lobbyist, and he said the governor has already done enough for you. He's not going to do anything more. And so we went to bed that night praying and hoping and wondering what was going to happen. But we came up with an action. We had busloads of people coming down from Chicago and from throughout the state. And we found out that the governor was going to be signing some bills. So we said, well, we're going to show up for that. And so we showed up at his office with all of these people. And I had a handwritten note that I gave to Lucy Soto, our president. He handed it to the governor's staff person, who said, well, the governor is never going to meet with you. But he brought it back, and he came out with a sheepish grin on his face, and he said, well, the governor won't meet with you right after he signs these bills. And so signs the bills, comes out and talks to Lucy, bounds up the steps onto the floor of the state Senate, which the governor never does, directly lobbied Republican senators, and there was nothing that Pate Phillip could do at that point. And we passed with those 10 Republicans. And of course, it later passed the House. And the governor, a few months later, showed up to our community Congress, the NCO Community Congress. We thanked him for that. And we also pushed him on some housing issues and some other things. And he formed a task force to deal with low-income housing. And so this, it was a really, a radical plan that low-income people should pay a percentage of their income. And it passed, and it really took care of this heat shutoff in Illinois. And 3 years later, the plan had sunset, but they formed a task force, and it actually passed unanimously through the state legislature with the utilities support, because the utilities figured this was working for them. They didn't have to shut people off. They found some money through the federal money to pay for the plan, so it was working for everybody. So it just shows you what ordinary folks can do with this kind of nonviolent, direct action approach to things, solving their own problems. And it can also, swinging back to John Lewis. I mean, John Lewis ended up in Congress, believed that the government could work for the people, and he was dedicated to that. And I think this was an example. This was before, this partisan, thing that we're in right now. But that you could touch legislatures, you can touch governors' hearts to do the right thing. And I hope we get back to that day in this country. And again, John Lewis was devoted to spiritual nonviolence. And, again, we were non-sectarian, but it was a lot of these folks were working really this Tennessee Interfaith life, power and light, working out of their faith. Ours was a very Catholic community. But, we have Black Baptist, holiness folks, again, Steph Krieger, Orthodox Jew. We had strong religious support in this, along with people's moral commitment, which fits in with John Lewis. Strong commitment to the methods and the spirit of nonviolence. Through all of this, we continued to treat our adversaries with respect, hoping that they would come and hear, their hearts would be open, and they finally were. We used direct action. We had low-income people. These folks were not in any position to get arrested. But we confronted, we took over offices and things like that, and used direct action. And the beloved community, it was interracial and it was diverse across the board. A very strong interracial, both in our community in Westtown and also the coalition that we founded. And again, that governance that serves the social goods and justice. So just to conclude, so again, that fits in with John Lewis's philosophy, I think, strongly. And these kinds of direct action campaigns can be very powerful. And through the tradition of the community, they knew how to do that. I'm sometimes afraid we're losing the sense of how to do these types of things. But I think we can bring it back. And I see some of it with the young folks with Sunrise and others that are starting to use these techniques. And in the Black Lives Matter movement, using direct action again to bring about change. And just to conclude, I mean, our 10 Care was not a complete success. The second one was. The civil rights years, in many ways, John Lewis was rowing hard. They were rowing hard, and they went through tremendous sacrifice. But in many ways, they were also rowing with the cultural, economic, and political currents of the country. In the last 40 years, it's been more like the wilderness. Those have been rowing. We've been rowing against the cultural, economic, and political currents in many ways. And I hope these currents change. We're still waiting for our Selma to cross over Jordan into a more promised land. And so direct action can be very powerful, but it also needs to connect with ordinary people and connect with, change people's hearts across the board. And so to change our culture and to change our politics, we need to do that. I'll just end with a quote from John Lewis. He ends his autobiography with this. There's an old African proverb, when you pray, move your feet. As a nation, if we care for the beloved community, we must move our feet, our hands, our hearts, our resources to build and not to kill. In the final analysis, we are one people, one family, one house, the American house, the American family. So John Lewis kept the faith to the end. And I hope that many of us, in lesser ways, can continue to do so. So thank you for staying with me through this presentation. And I hope we can be inspired by the life of John Lewis, but also be inspired by, well, he was an ordinary person too, but by all the many ordinary people that have sacrificed in the struggles for justice and for caring for each other. So that's my presentation. I'm going to turn it over to Boone and Aaron and Jennifer and others with the bountiful bowl, and people are welcome to stay on. And I know some folks are going to be eating together too. So Boone.